Hello, my friends. Today on Fishery, we are going to be talking about the greatest aquarist of all time. So, the other day, we got the sad news that Heiko Bleher passed away. Now, he wasn't a young man. He lived well up into older than the average male should live in our society. Of course, we always want people to live longer, but he wasn't a young man. He had a long and very full and active and adventurous life. And I think if you asked him himself, which I did, he wouldn't have done anything differently. He had an adventurous, incredible life, and he talked it up. Now, regardless of what you think of him, you have to admit that he's one of the luminaries or larger than life figures in fish keeping. Especially to those of us who started getting into the hobby perhaps before the internet and the democratization of anybody can be a fish keeper, anybody can be an expert level fish keeper. You are empowered to be able to learn on your own. It used to be more of a walled garden in the aquarium hobby, where you had to go to a club, you had to get magazines and books and years of studying and trial and error to know even the basics. You couldn't just pull up an article on anything. And if you look back on the last 10 years, we have lost everyone from Takashi Amano, basically the inventor of modern aquascaping. Now, don't get me wrong, aquascaping and underwater gardening existed 120 plus years ago in the Netherlands. It was very popular, and it was formed, and there was a school of it, and there are names associated with it that ring out throughout history. However, nobody reached out across the global community and inspired other hobbies, including fish keeping, the plants, vivariums, terrariums, and art design the way that Takashi Amano did. Now, he passed away nearly 10 years ago now, and obviously another legendary person. Herbert Axelrod, same thing. He was a juggernaut in the hobby, and whether you love him or hate him, and a lot of people have come out and they want to say, well, he was a real guy and he had flaws, and he wasn't this larger than life archetype of an aquarist or an adventurer or a scientist. He was just a guy. He was just in it to make a buck and happened to like fish, but he was this or that. Well, as much as that has gone on recently, until now, until the last, say, 20 years with the internet, those things get talked about somewhat between individuals, but there are only so many places that you get your information, for better or worse, in the hobby. And really early in the hobby, it was so new that science hadn't been yet defined of what is biology versus ecology versus ichthyology, just fish. And it really isn't until the 1800s and then the late 1800s that you have kind of the elite and just kind of a peculiar mix of people who are just obsessed with fish and nature that start to rise and become these names we know today, that are people, that you would say, oh, they invented the aquarium, or they had the first public aquarium, or they popularized the idea of keeping fish. And it was the upper class that kept things like goldfish, or that had ponds with koi and other fish that were decorative. Even going back to Roman times or Chinese ancient times, you have kind of an aristocracy that had fish. There was kind of a limited scope to who knew about fish keeping and who would be interested in it, and whether it was for looks or for the love of the science and the hobby and the whole package. And it's really not until World War II ends that we have the overnight speed of jet engine planes. We have intercontinental travel overnight and affordably, somewhat affordably. And we can get the fish that are from the magazines and books that we would oogle and ooh and ah over, or see maybe in a movie or a picture. And these things were still new in the 20th century. You know, it wasn't until around World War I that we first started even seeing warm water aquarists and fish keepers in America. And we see with the advent of electricity spreading into the home, and then the democratization of a growing American and European middle class, that by the 1920s, there are affordable things like aquarium pumps or compressors and heaters and lights and all the things needed to just even keep the fish alive, let alone get a fish from the middle of the Amazon or the middle of India in some river out to New York or Berlin. And it is the people that set up these networks that sell the fish. Heiko's family, his mother, his grandfather and grandmother, his family was famous in Germany for establishing some of the earliest, fish keeping and aquatic botanical plant trade. And he grew up in the field, and he is kind of what created the archetypal Indiana Jones adventurer, like the fact that you could be a Jacques Cousteau. He's another one who passed away long ago, but he was another person that's larger than life that so many of us grew up watching on TV or in books, when there was a limited scope of who was famous and what was famous and what was popular. And there were so many fish and things that we didn't even know about at the time. So even if they weren't discovered yet, there were many of these fish that were just out there, and all it took was being the one who had the TV show and the charisma and the time to say, look at this fish you've never seen before. And color television by the 1950s, 60s, really the 70s, it is when really this goes full blown. And that's why we are losing these people. People like Rosario Lacorte, people like Paul Loisel, Albert Klee, however you'd like to say his last name. Really incredible luminaries. And you could think of other names like Innes, like Ingemann or Schultz. There's other people obviously that are very famous in the fish hobby, but the greatest generation of fish keepers, I think, is really going to be that generation that spanned the gap of the middle class of Europe and America and Asia, Japan and Hong Kong and places, being able to own fish, communities of tropical fish, and them being affordable, and them being brought to stores where you could actually attain them, and you didn't have to know someone who knew someone who knew someone to end up with, something that's from a far reach of the earth. And it's because of this, whether it's fully deserved or not, that a lot of these people get the credit and held the key to these walled kingdoms. And I don't think there's anything necessarily nefarious about it either. A lot of times, teams, hundreds or thousands of scientists are working on discovering new species, yet it's the one who comes out to make the announcement at the press conference who, has a little twinkle in their eye that may be the one who stands out historically as the one who made the discovery, when really it was a team effort or whatnot. Like Edison's workshop or Tesla, you think of them as these mad inventors, and they were brilliant, but they had teams of other people, and there were many Enlightenment thinkers doing very similar things also. Now with the aquarium hobby, you could argue that these people lived to see phones, cell phones, fish clubs being set up around the country, and they could travel and they would give their talks from the 1950s and 60s all the way up to today, and they could give a talk to each club all around the Western world and Japan and Hong Kong and China now these days too. Indonesia, now India, the world has opened up fully now. And so arguably, you could say more people now are exposed to YouTubers and aquarists that are famous, right? But were they the ones who shaped the hobby? And I'm not saying that this generation of these people that are so notable that we're losing, unfortunately, I'm not saying that they were better or greater necessarily in any tangible way than anybody else who's working hard today at just exploring new fish and researching genomics and fossil records and fish keeping and breeding new fish in captivity that have never been bred before, and preservation and conservation. No, that's so important. And teaching new people how to keep fish, and that teaching the next generation, that's also important. But the people who came up with the kind of archetypal way to do that, after seeing it done a generation or two from the very first fish keepers, the people who figured out how to streamline it, how to make it sleek, how to sell it, how to put it in magazines and color print it and make it an hour-long special on the Discovery Channel, that generation is who we're losing. And that's what made it feel larger than life, for better or worse, was that walled garden of academia that back in the day it used to feel like a PhD or doctorate degree meant something authoritatively and meant something that that person just knew a little bit more than anyone else about that thing. And whether that's a good or bad thing in your mind, it is just kind of how I think a lot of us saw the world, especially people a little older than me. I'm 40 years old myself. And, I feel like I just saw the edge of all this. And I want to ask you guys, do you think I'm right by saying that we're never going to see a generation where so few but big names, there's maybe 20 or 30 names that were the luminaries of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, and that shaped, what fish we keep? Why is it that we have rummy nose tetras and neon tetras? Yeah, they're beautiful, sure. But as Heiko Bleher, his company, shipped them out in the 1960s, made them popular, got featured in Tropical Fish magazine. Herbert Axelrod ran the articles on it. They figured out these things, and they were affordable. They were in large numbers. There's reasons behind these things. And of course, if you're interested in all that, we can explore that, and we can talk about the, shortcomings and scandals and the real history of things if you want to get granular. But just when you step back, every time you hear one of these legendary names that seems like they'll be with us forever, if you've been someone who's loved the fish hobby since you were young, like myself, when you hear that they've passed on, it really hits home, especially because we're in the generation where we got to meet them at the fish club. They came around, and yes, that happened before, but now we also got to read their book. We got to get their autograph, celebrity, and almost a level of fame within our small little pond, our small fishbowl. And the fact that, color TV, video, film, and people being able to share that on their own, we went through the transition of that being only expensive production companies and TV channels or movie studios deciding that they would feature those things. And so it needed to be a select, elite, and hierarchical structure that ran that and decided who gets to see what in the movie theater. It's not going to be fish every day, but maybe before a movie you'll get a 15-minute reel of the Bahamas, and it was Jacques Cousteau, it was Herbert Axelrod, it was these names that got established. And by the next generation or later in that same timeline, these people figured out how to really, streamline it, make it so that everybody could afford a little piece of that. And so we all learned about how to do it. I mean, we didn't even know how to keep these fish before. And so the democratization of information is going to make it so that there are less larger than life characters, I think, in that it's more attainable to become one of these people, to become an ichthyologist today. Yet at the same time, there's more noise today, and there's more mediocrity today that you have to sort through. And so the authoritative sources that everyone looks to, we need to be so much more careful about them. And that's what I'm striving to do on my channel, and I hope you guys hold me to that with my facts and my info. But I'd like to hear what you think. Do you think this next generation of us YouTubers and ichthyologists currently working today, do you think in the next 20 or 30 years that we'll have another wave of people that are as famous or as singularly great? Will there be 20 or 30 names that stand out above the rest that we think of as the great or the standard bearers for the hobby? And I think whether you like that or don't like that, and you think it's great that now it's been more democratized, I do think that it is a particular era and feel to the way we kept fish and we keep fish that's changing, and it has changed the last 20 years or so majorly, and in many ways for the better. You know, more access to information, keeping fish more responsibly. Hopefully we're doing more conservation and advocacy, but there's a little less magic when you can see what's going on behind the show. So I'd love to hear your take. I'd love to also hear who are the greats or giants in your mind, and who are the people that get left out. Who's an ichthyologist that's named all your favorite, I don't know, whiptail catfish or farrowallas, and they're not even known. I mean, there's people like Ian Fuller that maybe Corydoras lovers will know, or Gary Lang or Jerry Allen, you know, with the rainbow fish. Like, shout out those people in the comments. I'd love to know, especially too, like, who's out there today that really inspires you? And do you think that they have the same level of notoriety as that generation we're losing right now? The greatest generation of aquarists. As I like to think of it, when I look at the history of the hobby, I really think there was a rise and a consolidation of media and consumerism, in the sense of what you could buy, who could buy it, the color film, the video and photo and phones and travel and all these things, just technology, and the science of keeping the fish alive and going out and discovering how they live, what they eat, things like that, just converged at that time to be that way. And I'd love to hear your take. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time on Fishery. Of course, rest in peace to all those aquarists who have gone before us. May wherever you are be a fishy place.